Welcome to my channel. A routine flight turned into a life-or-death nightmare, and one pilot had to make a choice that could cost her everything. Breaking all the rules, she saved a passenger's life, but was punished for her courage. Then, 48 hours later, the unthinkable happened. The president himself stepped in. You won't believe the shocking aftermath of Flight 812. I had flown through storms that seemed determined to break me, and landed aircraft with engines whining like wounded beasts. Yet nothing prepared me for the chaos that erupted on Flight 812 the morning we were bound for Seattle. The cabin had been calm, passengers quietly reading, sleeping, or scrolling through their devices. I was reviewing the weather and fuel reports when the intercom crackled. Captain Harper, the voice of First Officer Reynolds, said, "Tense. We have a medical emergency. Passenger in 14B is unresponsive. Heart rate dropping fast." I froze for a fraction of a second. Then instinct took over. This wasn't about procedure or schedules. It was about life. I had a choice. Continue to Seattle, an hour and 45 minutes away, and risk losing him, or divert to the nearest airport. My hands gripped the yoke as I calculated the odds in seconds. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. Control, this is Flight 812. Requesting emergency landing. Medical crisis on board, I said, my voice steady even as adrenaline surged. Reynolds' eyes met mine, a silent question there, but he trusted me. The descent began. Turbulence rattled the fuselage, and passengers clung to their armrests as we fought crosswinds. I could feel the airplane responding to every touch, every adjustment, as if it knew the stakes. When the landing gear touched the runway, the tires screamed against the asphalt, and I knew we had made it. Ambulances converged, paramedics rushed down the aisle, and the man, Mr. Elias Monroe, was lifted onto a stretcher, his life hanging by the thread of minutes. We had saved him. And yet, even as the relief washed over passengers, as the crew shared quiet glances of reassurance, I knew the consequences were already in motion. By the time I walked back to the cockpit, I had a message waiting on my phone. It wasn't from family or friends or even the airline's standard notifications. It was the suspension order. 30 days without pay, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. The rationale was simple. I had broken protocol. The airline didn't see a man's life preserved. They saw $52,000 in fuel, 18 rerouted flights, and the disruption of schedules. My compassion had been reduced to a line item on a spreadsheet. I handed over my wings and my captain's cap in silence. The room was thick with unspoken judgment. Some colleagues averted their eyes. Others smirked with the smug satisfaction of bureaucratic loyalty. A few, though quietly, nodded in recognition of the choice I had made, even if they dared not say it aloud. Walking through the terminal that afternoon, I carried only a small duffel and the weight of 24 years of flying. My footsteps echoed, and each one reminded me of the irony. I had spent a lifetime serving lives, only to have my own career questioned for doing what I knew was right. At home that evening, the news ran segments branding me reckless. Online forums debated the morality of my decision. Social media churned with extremes. Some applauded my courage, others condemned my defiance. The noise was deafening, yet I remained silent. I didn't need to justify compassion. I had lived it. As night fell over Portland, Oregon, I walked through my empty apartment, reflecting on the morning. Mr. Monroe was alive because I had acted, because procedure had not shackled judgment. I didn't need accolades. The knowledge that I had done the right thing, that one family would keep their grandfather, was enough. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I sensed that this story wasn't over, that the weight of choices and the recognition they deserved would come in ways I could not yet see. The morning after the suspension felt heavier than any turbulence I had ever faced. Portland's streets stretched out like gray ribbons beneath my car, but the world outside seemed oblivious to the storm inside me. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt hollow, as though it were holding its breath along with me. Messages buzzed on my phone, a constant stream of notifications. Some were supportive, though cautious. "We understand. You did the right thing." Many more were venomous, questioning my judgment, mocking my decision. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every reply felt like trying to explain the wind to a kite in a storm. Pointless and ultimately futile. Colleagues avoided me at the airport. Even the flight attendants I had worked with for years looked away, as if my mere presence reminded them of some unspoken shame. A few whispered in corners, their voices low but sharp. "She thinks she's a hero." Bending the rules again, I bet. Their words stung, but not as much as the quiet absence of the camaraderie I had once relied upon. I kept my routine. Morning runs through empty parks, evenings leafing through aviation manuals I had memorized decades ago. The rhythm grounded me. It reminded me that while the world may judge, the truth of a choice is known only to the one who makes it. Yet there was a hollow ache. 24 years of my life spent in service to the skies, saved lives, and earned trust, all condensed into a single moment of perceived recklessness. I walked through the halls of my apartment building and felt like a ghost, invisible and scrutinized at once. Even sleep offered little respite. Nightmares of stalled engines and failing altimeters were replaced by visions of Mr. Monroe's life flickering like a candle in the wind. I would wake in the early hours, drenched in sweat, telling myself the truth. I had acted. I had saved him. And no memo, no suspension, could take that away. The local news ran snippets of my transgression, painting me as a rule breaker, someone who had prioritized emotion over procedure. I didn't recognize the person they described. The quiet dignity I had carried through turbulence and crisis was invisible to them. Numbers and policy had replaced faces and lives in their narrative. Even friends approached cautiously. One called and paused before speaking, careful not to let judgment slip. "Are you okay?" they asked. I nodded, though it felt like a small lie. "I'm fine," I said, letting the words settle around me like armor. They left, reassured, or perhaps just relieved that I wasn't breaking down in public. In the silence of my apartment, I thought about Mr. Monroe, about the family who would see him alive that night. I imagined the slow rise of hope in their eyes, the quiet gratitude that would never make headlines. That was the only validation I needed. Life mattered more than protocol. Compassion mattered more than bureaucracy. And yet, I knew the storm wasn't over. Suspensions were meant to teach lessons, to bend those who didn't conform to the rules. But I had learned a different lesson, one that no memo could erase. Some choices rise above procedure, above policy, above the expectations of a world too rigid to see beyond its own rules. I closed my manuals and sat in the quiet. The city hummed outside, oblivious to the tension I carried. I traced the outline of my wings in my mind, remembered the feel of their metal against my uniform, the weight of responsibility and pride they had represented. And I promised myself something, silently. I would endure this storm as I had endured every other, with calm, with dignity, with the unwavering knowledge that I had done what was right. 48 hours had passed since that morning, but the world had yet to see the full measure of what had transpired. I didn't know it yet, but the story of Flight 812, the choice I had made, was about to take a turn that would silence even the loudest critics. I was sitting by the window that morning, the Portland skyline muted under a blanket of gray clouds, when the call came. Not from the airline, not from family, not even from the hospital. It was a terse, official-sounding voice that didn't leave room for questions. "Captain Harper," it said, "please report to the regional airfield immediately. Classified orders. Security clearance required. Do not disclose details." I blinked at the phone, my heart thudding in a rhythm I hadn't felt since takeoff. The city outside seemed to hold its breath with me. I didn't know why or what awaited me, but something told me this wasn't routine. The drive was tense. Streets that usually felt familiar now seemed alien. I replayed the morning of Flight 812 in my mind. The rapid descent, the trembling hands of the flight attendants, Mr. Monroe's fading pulse. The thought of him alive now filled me with quiet satisfaction, but the phone call suggested that my actions had resonated far beyond that moment. At the airfield, everything was different. The usual hum of activity was replaced by a rigid stillness. Runways cleared with military precision, security personnel moved like synchronized shadows, and every vehicle seemed to glide into place before I even registered its presence. There was an electric tension in the air, as if everyone present knew they were on the edge of witnessing something monumental. I was guided through the perimeter by agents whose faces were hidden behind dark sunglasses and stern expressions. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of expectation pressing against my shoulders. Then I saw it. Air Force One, its massive body gleaming under the low morning sun, engines thrumming with restrained power. My breath caught. I had seen many aircraft in my career, but none carried the presence of history, authority, and responsibility in the way this plane did. Security protocols escalated instantly. Officers snapped to attention, scanning, checking, coordinating. The hum of machinery and movement created a tense symphony. And there, at the edge of it all, I realized I wasn't here to be questioned or reprimanded or analyzed. I was here for something else entirely. As I walked toward the tarmac, my uniform absent, my wings and cap tucked away, I felt the gaze of dozens of people on me. Some curious, some wary, some openly critical. Yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. I only saw the aircraft, and I only thought of the life that had been saved because I had dared to act. Then the president stepped down the stairs. The presence of a single human being could sometimes fill a room with authority. This man did it to an entire airfield. His gaze swept across the crowd, deliberate and unflinching, before resting on me. Time slowed. Cameras clicked, engines thrummed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, the noise of suspension orders, online debate, and whispered criticism vanished. It was just him, me, and the truth of Flight 812. He walked toward me, each step measured, intentional. I straightened instinctively, though I didn't know why. I didn't need to. The answer, the recognition, was about to arrive, not from charts or memos, but from the highest authority in the land. And when he reached me, his hand extended, his eyes steady, I realized that everything I had endured in these 48 hours, the whispers, the judgment, the isolation, was about to meet its reckoning. I felt no relief, no triumph. Only the quiet knowledge that some choices, no matter the cost, demand to be seen, demand to be honored. The president spoke my name clearly, carrying it across the tarmac as if announcing the truth itself. Captain Harper, on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you. I could barely process the words before a medal was pinned to my jacket, the weight of it tangible, heavy, and righteous. Life preserved, judgment silenced, recognition undeniable. In that moment, I understood fully, rules serve people, and sometimes, people must rise above rules. The airfield was silent after the president's words. I stood there, medal pinned to my jacket, feeling the weight of something far greater than gold or metal. It wasn't pride I felt, it was validation. The validation of a choice that had been questioned, ridiculed, and punished. I noticed the airline executives standing awkwardly to one side, their faces pale, eyes darting between me and the president. Richard Davenport, their vice president, who had signed my suspension, looked like a man caught in a storm he could neither control nor escape. Every word he had rehearsed, the lectures, the warnings, the justifications, crumbled in the presence of a truth he could not deny. I could feel the whispers ripple through the crowd behind me. Colleagues who had mocked, sneered, and whispered behind my back now looked at me with something between awe and guilt. I didn't seek their approval. I didn't need it. But the shift in their demeanor was undeniable. The unspoken acknowledgement of courage had arrived without fanfare, without debate, without compromise. Later, news cameras swarmed, capturing every angle, every moment. Anchors recounted the events of Flight 812 with renewed emphasis, finally telling the story of life saved instead of dollars lost. Social media, which had been a torrent of criticism and mockery, pivoted overnight. Hashtag Captain Harper trended, this time in reverence rather than derision. Passengers, flight crews, and aviation enthusiasts shared stories of the calm professionalism that had defined my career long before this singular moment. Even at the airline, the narrative began to shift. Policies that once demanded strict adherence without consideration for human life were quietly re-examined. Internal emails leaked praise for my judgment, for my ability to act decisively when procedure alone could not save a life. I heard colleagues whisper that if they had the courage, they would have acted the same way, but fear had held them back. Yet the public's attention wasn't my goal. The real measure of this moment was personal, intimate. I thought of Mr. Monroe and his family. I thought of the ICU room filled with the hum of machines, the quiet prayers, and the relief that one life had been preserved against odds that could have been catastrophic. No headline, no camera angle, no social media trend could replicate that. That truth existed quietly, beyond the reach of judgment, waiting only to be acknowledged by those who mattered. In the following days, colleagues approached me tentatively. First Officer Reynolds, usually stoic, came by with a small, awkward smile. I was wrong, he said. We all were. You did the right thing. I nodded, letting him feel the weight of that simple acknowledgement. No dramatics, no lectures, just recognition that the choice I had made was correct, and that, in its quiet way, it had reshaped our understanding of duty. Flight attendants who had worked with me for years shared their relief in hushed tones. We knew, they said. We trusted you. Their words weren't meant for the press. They were meant for me, for the integrity of our shared work. And that mattered more than any medal, any public accolade. Even the airline scrambled to rewrite history. Ads were drafted, videos produced, highlighting the human side of aviation and the courage required to make impossible decisions. It smelled more of political necessity than sincerity, but I let them spin their narrative. My story wasn't theirs to control. It never had been. At night, walking through empty streets, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the world had finally witnessed the truth. That validation from the highest office in the land had nothing to do with ego, and everything to do with life, humanity, and courage. I had done what no procedure, no policy, no fear of reprimand could dictate. I had chosen to save a life. And in that choice, I had discovered something even more enduring than recognition. The knowledge that integrity, courage, and compassion could stand firm, even when the world demanded conformity. Even when the world judged harshly, quietly, and without context, the right choice had power beyond measure. Returning to the cockpit after everything that had happened felt surreal. The seat beneath me smelled faintly of leather and polish, the yoke familiar under my hands like an old friend. Yet this time, the weight I carried wasn't the usual responsibility of safely guiding hundreds of passengers through the skies. It was something heavier, the knowledge that each decision I made could ripple far beyond the cockpit, touching lives I might never see. I ran my hands over the controls, noting the worn edges, the subtle nicks earned over decades of landings and takeoffs. 24 years of flying, of living in the rhythm of engines and altimeters, had brought me here. And now, that rhythm carried a new meaning. It wasn't just about the procedure. It was about judgment, compassion, and courage. My first flight back after the suspension drew whispers and glances from passengers and crew alike. I noticed them, but didn't acknowledge them. Their quiet respect, the reverent nods, the unspoken acknowledgement, it was more powerful than any applause. They knew, in some way, what it meant to prioritize humanity over convenience. They had witnessed it, or at least felt its echo. Reynolds flew beside me again, quiet but steady. It's different now, he murmured. You've changed how everyone sees us. I didn't reply. The cockpit didn't require words. The plane did. The passengers did. The very air seemed to hum with the reminder that choices define us more than accolades ever could. I thought often of Mr. Monroe. I imagined him laughing with his grandchildren, holding the hand of a loved one in quiet thanks. The memory of his weak pulse stabilizing, of the paramedics rushing him from the cabin, stayed with me like a mantra. One life preserved could outweigh countless policies broken. The airline, desperate to salvage its image, began a campaign highlighting heroic pilots and exceptional judgment under pressure. Their sincerity was questionable, but it no longer mattered. The narrative of Flight 812 had escaped their control. Recognition, whether institutional or societal, could never erase the quiet truth I had lived, that some decisions must rise above procedure. At night, when the airport had emptied and the hum of aircraft engines faded into silence, I would sit in the empty terminal, staring at the tarmac, replaying every landing, every emergency, every critical decision in my mind. Some were perfect, some weren't, but each had taught me something about responsibility, resilience, and the human cost of choices. I realized that flying was never just a job. It was a responsibility, not only to the people aboard, but to life itself. That understanding shaped the way I approached each flight afterward. I wasn't just moving planes through the sky. I was navigating the fragile, unpredictable nature of human existence. Every check, every adjustment, every command carried weight beyond procedure. Some colleagues still whispered behind my back, their voices tinged with jealousy, fear, or lingering doubt. I let them speak. Their judgments were meaningless in the face of lived truth. I had walked through shadows, endured judgment, and remained steady. Let their words linger. They could not touch the quiet certainty of knowing I had chosen correctly. In those early weeks, I also began mentoring younger pilots, sharing the lessons learned not from manuals, but from experience. Procedure is essential, I would say, but so is judgment. Sometimes the two conflict, and that's when your courage matters most. Their eyes widened with understanding, some even awe. I didn't need to embellish my stories. The truth was compelling enough. And always, I thought of Flight 812. Not the headlines, not the social media debate, not even the medal, just the quiet, human heartbeat of a life preserved. It reminded me daily why I had chosen to rise above procedure, why compassion must sometimes carry the weight of consequence, and why courage, above all, defines the pilot, the human, and the legacy left behind. Weeks passed, but the echo of Flight 812 never faded. In the quiet moments between flights, I found myself reflecting not just on the emergency itself, but on how that single choice had begun to ripple through the aviation world. What I had done was no longer just my story. It had become a reference point, a lesson in judgment, courage, and humanity. I noticed the change first in my co-pilots. They approached me with a new level of attentiveness, a silent acknowledgement that flying was more than charts, manuals, and schedules. In our briefings, Reynolds would reference scenarios with careful precision, often glancing at me to gauge whether the instinctive decisions he proposed aligned with the ethos we now shared. There was a quiet pride in that, a subtle passing of responsibility and trust that I could feel in the tight grip of a yoke or the steady hum of an engine. Flight attendants began speaking differently, too. Gone were the hushed criticisms or cautious suggestions. Instead, they sought guidance, shared concerns openly, and sometimes even offered small bits of reassurance. "We trust your call, Captain. We always have." Their trust wasn't granted lightly. It had been earned through years of shared risk and, now, through an unflinching demonstration of courage. The airline could no longer ignore the human side of aviation. Safety protocols were reviewed with an emphasis not only on efficiency, but on judgment in exceptional situations. Workshops were held, and my name, my story, and the events of Flight 812 were discussed not as a cautionary tale of rule-breaking, but as an example of prioritizing life without abandoning professionalism. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of passengers who had been on that flight, their eyes wide when they recognized me. Some whispered thanks, others simply nodded, as though acknowledgement itself could express gratitude words never could. The quiet moments mattered more than public acclaim, more than headlines. They were proof that my decision had been meaningful where it counted. Even veteran pilots began to shift their perspective. At Murphy's, the bar near the main airfield where stories, laughter, and frustration mingled, references to Pull a Harper slowly changed in tone. Where once it had been a joke about recklessness, it was now spoken with respect, often accompanied by a quiet shake of the head. Some still resisted, clinging to strict adherence to procedure, but the dialogue had begun. The idea that judgment, courage, and compassion were as vital as manuals and checklists was taking root. Letters began to arrive, many anonymous, some from young pilots still in training. "I want to fly like you," one wrote. "Not just follow instructions, but know when to lead, when to choose life over procedure." Others came from passengers, families, and veterans, all expressing gratitude for a decision they hadn't directly witnessed but had felt the impact of. Their words were carefully written, sometimes trembling, often filled with humility. Each one reminded me that the value of a life preserved could not be measured by spreadsheets, profit margins, or corporate reports. Even the president's recognition, though formal and public, was secondary to the quiet human acknowledgement that followed. Marine Sergeant Monroe had returned home fully recovered, and the knowledge that I had indirectly touched an entire family, a community, and even a nation was more enduring than any medal or press conference. As I moved through the terminal on routine days, young pilots and crew would approach hesitantly, seeking insight, reassurance, or simply to meet the woman who had made a difficult choice when procedure alone would not suffice. I offered guidance with the same calm I carried through every landing. I didn't boast. I didn't lecture. I simply shared the quiet truth. Courage and judgment are inseparable. And in those moments, I realized something profound. Flight 812 had not only saved a life, it had begun to shape a culture, to plant seeds of responsibility and humanity in a profession often dominated by rigid rules and calculations. My choice had created ripples, small but steady, that reached further than I could have imagined. I knew this journey was far from over. Each flight, each decision, carried the weight of precedent. And each time I strapped in, I carried the quiet understanding that courage is not always loud, that leadership often comes not from authority, but from the unwavering commitment to do what is right when it matters most. Even after the public recognition faded, the impact of Flight 812 followed me everywhere. The headlines and news segments were temporary. They ebbed and flowed like tides. But the personal stories, the faces, the whispers of gratitude remained. One evening, I received a letter from Mrs. Monroe. I unfolded the paper carefully, expecting something polite but brief. Instead, I found paragraphs filled with quiet reverence, words trembling with relief and love. She wrote about sitting by her husband's bedside, holding his hand while the machines hummed steadily, and feeling hope return in the midst of fear. She described the children and grandchildren who now had a grandfather to laugh with, to guide, and to love, thanks to a decision I had made in the air. I couldn't help the lump in my throat. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, overwhelmed not by the praise, but by the realization that a single choice had reverberated through so many lives. No medal, no ceremony, no headline could ever match that. Another letter arrived weeks later, from a young pilot named Mia, just finishing her training. "I want to fly like you," she wrote. "I want to know when to follow procedure and when to follow my heart. I want to be brave, even when it's easier to be safe." Her words reminded me that courage is not solitary. It inspires, shapes, and endures beyond the moment. I began keeping the letters in a small box, tucked safely on a shelf beside my manuals. I didn't read them often. I didn't need to. Just knowing they existed was enough to sustain me through long nights and routine flights. Each envelope was a heartbeat, a reminder that life mattered more than metrics, more than schedules, more than fear of reprimand. Sometimes, when I returned from a flight, passengers would approach quietly at the gate. An elderly woman would place a hand on my arm. A young boy would wave shyly. A father would offer a nod of thanks. None of them demanded my story, nor did they need it. They simply recognized the person who had once made a choice to preserve life over procedure. Their small gestures carried a weight far beyond words. The airport itself, once a place of judgment and whispers, had begun to feel different. Flight crews would stop by, sharing stories or seeking guidance, their voices carrying respect rather than doubt. Even Murphy's Bar, the hangout where cynicism had once thrived, now murmured my name in admiration. "That Harper," they'd say quietly, "she knows what matters." Despite this, solitude remained my companion. I often walked the empty streets of Portland late at night, letting the city's quiet envelop me. Streetlights glimmered against wet pavement, and I thought about the lives saved, the families intact, the ripple effect of one decision. These moments were private, unseen, but essential. They reminded me why I flew, why I chose courage over convenience, and why human life always came first. On the days when the weight of scrutiny returned, when news cycles questioned judgment or dissected policy, I would take a deep breath and return to the letters, the memories, the faces of those who mattered. In those moments, I knew my choices were right. And in that quiet, I could feel a deeper truth, that honor, integrity, and courage exist not for applause, but to endure, unseen and unwavering, until they are needed most. Through it all, I learned that the life of a pilot extends far beyond the cockpit. It extends into the hearts of those we serve, the families we touch, and the young pilots who will carry the legacy of judgment and humanity forward. Flight 812 was no longer just a story. It had become a responsibility, a guidepost, a silent oath. And I would honor it, always. Flying had always been more than a career to me. It was a commitment, a calling, a silent promise that every life aboard my aircraft mattered more than any schedule, policy, or rulebook. But Flight 812 crystallized something I had long felt, but had never fully articulated. The measure of a life, and the measure of a pilot, cannot be reduced to checklists or profit margins. In the quiet cockpit, I reflected on every decision I had made, every risk I had calculated, every instinct I had trusted. The line between procedure and judgment is a thin one, often blurred, yet essential. Following procedure is safe. Exercising judgment is courageous. And sometimes, as I had learned, courage is the only path to preserving what matters most. I thought of Mr. Monroe's family again, their letters, their gratitude, the knowledge that a grandfather would see birthdays, holidays, and milestones he might not have lived to witness. Their lives were forever intertwined with a single moment of choice, a decision that had demanded courage in the face of criticism and consequence. That was the real weight of my profession, the unseen ledger of human life that no corporate report could capture. Mentoring young pilots became a sacred responsibility. I encouraged them to master the manuals, to respect the rules, and to anticipate emergencies, but I also urged them to listen to their instincts. Rules guide us, I would say, but judgment defines us. There will be moments when doing what's right requires rising above procedure. You must be prepared for that. You must have courage. Some resisted the idea. What if we make the wrong call, they asked. I would smile gently. Then you learn. But the wrong call made out of fear is far worse than the right call made with courage. Trust yourself, trust your training, and above all, trust your humanity. Internally, I wrestled with the balance between humility and pride. I did not seek recognition, nor did I crave validation. Yet acknowledgement from others, letters, nods, whispers of respect, reminded me that our choices echo far beyond the moments we inhabit. They become part of a larger story, one that shapes those who follow. Sometimes, at the end of long flights, I would sit alone on the tarmac, watching the sun rise or set over Portland, Oregon. The city's skyline framed the horizon, a reminder of the ordinary world continuing below the extraordinary choices made in the skies above. I would breathe deeply, feeling the quiet power of knowing that Flight 812 had preserved a life, had inspired colleagues, and had reminded everyone that humanity belongs at the center of every decision. Even when rules were questioned, when policy seemed rigid and unforgiving, I held on to one truth. Courage and compassion are inseparable. They guide us when the path is uncertain, illuminate choices when logic and procedure alone are insufficient, and sustain us when criticism threatens to break our spirit. I understood finally that my career was not measured by flights logged or miles flown, but by the integrity of my decisions, the lives I touched, and the courage I exercised when no one was watching. That understanding grounded me more than any cockpit ever could, and it gave meaning to every flight I would ever take. Through storms, turbulence, and quiet skies alike, I carried that truth with me, a constant companion reminding me that every choice matters, that courage has a weight beyond gold medals, and that the measure of a pilot is the measure of her humanity. Months passed, but Flight 812's legacy refused to fade. I found myself invited to speak at aviation conferences, workshops, and training sessions, not as a celebrity, but as a guide, a mentor, someone who could bridge the gap between protocol and judgment. I spoke of decision-making under pressure, of courage, and of the human consequences that statistics and charts could never capture. Some listeners were skeptical. But what about liability? They asked. What if someone misinterprets this? I would nod, acknowledging the concern, and then I would remind them. We follow rules because they save lives. We exercise judgment because they save souls. There is no contradiction, only responsibility. At one conference in San Francisco, a young pilot approached me afterward. Captain Harper, he said quietly, I didn't know what I'd do if I faced that situation. But listening to you, I think I'd have the courage now. His words settled in my chest, a quiet confirmation that the choice I had made was not just an isolated act, but a model, a lesson that could ripple across time and experience. Even at the airline, the culture began to shift subtly but noticeably. Crew members began to speak more openly about judgment calls, to share experiences without fear of immediate reprimand. Policies were amended to allow greater discretion in emergencies, balancing safety with humanity. It wasn't perfect, and there were still skeptics, but the seed had been planted. And that, I realized, was more enduring than any headline or award. I often returned to the letters from the Monroe family, reading them slowly, savoring the quiet impact of a life saved. Mrs. Monroe's updates chronicled birthdays, holidays, and small milestones. Each note was a reminder that courage resonates far beyond the moment, that one choice can echo through generations. I kept them in a small wooden box on my desk, a quiet testament to what truly mattered. Sometimes, though, the whispers returned, the subtle reminders of the suspension, the muted criticisms, the colleagues who still questioned my judgment. I let them exist at the periphery because I had learned that validation from the right sources, lives saved, lessons shared, courage exercised, was far more important than appeasing cynics. One day, at a regional training session, a veteran pilot asked, almost as an afterthought, "Do you ever regret it?" The question caught me off guard. I paused, considering the weight of every decision I had made since that day. And then I shook my head, quietly but firmly. "Never," I said. "Some choices define who we are. This was one of them. I would do it again." There was a silence in the room, a collective recognition of the truth in that statement. Courage, they realized, was not a singular act, but a continuous commitment to integrity, to life, and to the people who rely on us. Returning to the cockpit after these engagements felt different. I no longer carried just responsibility. I carried purpose. Every passenger, every flight crew, every decision reminded me of what Flight 812 had taught me, that the human element in aviation is inseparable from the technical, that life is always the ultimate measure of success. And quietly, without fanfare or recognition, I began to see the fruits of that legacy. Young pilots who once hesitated in emergencies now spoke confidently of judgment, compassion, and courage. Crew members approached me with questions, not criticism. The whispers of doubt faded, replaced by nods of understanding, quiet smiles, and the unspoken acknowledgement that some choices, though invisible to the world, have a measurable impact. I realized then that my triumph was quiet, yet enduring. It wasn't in medals, awards, or headlines. It was in the choices of others, the lives saved indirectly, the lessons passed down, and the courage that I had inspired to endure beyond my own flights. The legacy of Flight 812 was not mine alone. It belonged to everyone who would carry its lessons into the skies. Years have passed since Flight 812, yet the memory of that night remains vivid in every takeoff, every landing, and every decision I make. Portland's skyline has changed, my wings have aged with me, and yet the lessons of courage, judgment, and humanity remain as sharp as ever. I often find myself sitting in the cockpit before dawn, watching the sun stretch across the horizon. The engines hum beneath me, familiar and steady, and I breathe in the calm of the morning. It is in these quiet moments that I remember the faces of those I saved, the faint pulse of life that reminded me why we fly, why we choose, why we endure. Letters from the Monroe family still arrive, folded and precise, filled with updates about birthdays, school graduations, and family milestones. Each one is a testament to the enduring consequences of a single decision made under pressure. I read them slowly, often aloud when the airport is quiet, and I feel a profound gratitude, not for recognition, but for the privilege of having played a role in someone's life. The aviation world has shifted subtly, a change I can see in young pilots, in crew members, in mentors who now approach judgment calls with a greater understanding of human consequence. Flight 812 became a silent guide, a reference point, a reminder that courage is inseparable from responsibility. The culture is not perfect, but it is better, braver, and more compassionate. I think of the moments that were mine alone, the adrenaline, the fear, the clarity of decision. I think of the lives saved, the families untouched by tragedy, the lessons quietly imparted to those who will fly long after I am gone. That is my legacy, not the medal, not the news, not the fleeting applause of the world. My legacy is the quiet power of courage and action, of choices made when no one else is watching, of humanity prevailing where it is often overlooked. And sometimes, I still hear the faint echoes of critics, of colleagues who doubted, of procedures that felt rigid and unyielding. I let those whispers fade into the background, because I have learned that true courage does not require approval. It requires resolve. True honor does not demand recognition. It stands on its own, steadfast, unwavering, and enduring. As I walk through the terminal, or pass by a flight crew, or see a young pilot hesitate before making a choice, I carry the knowledge that some decisions matter more than procedure, more than policy, more than fear. I carry the quiet confidence that humanity, courage, and integrity are the true measures of our lives. Flight 812 changed me, not because of the accolades or headlines, but because it reminded me that life is fragile, fleeting, and precious. It reminded me that one moment, one choice, can ripple across time, touching lives far beyond our immediate view. That is the power of courage. That is the weight of responsibility. That is the essence of honor. I do not speak of it loudly. I do not boast. I do not seek applause. But in the quiet hum of the engines, in the steady hands of a young pilot learning to trust herself, in the letters and faces of those touched by choice, I know the truth. Courage lives. Humanity endures. And the legacy of Flight 812 continues, invisible yet undeniable, a reminder that even in a world governed by rules and numbers, one person's decision can illuminate the way forward. I breathe deeply, fasten my seatbelt, and prepare for takeoff. The sky stretches before me, endless and waiting. I rise, carrying with me the quiet strength of a life lived with courage, guided by judgment, and anchored in humanity. Dignity does not fall. It rises, steadfast, through the storms and silence alike. And as I ascend, I know that the power of one choice, made with courage, compassion, and integrity, can echo far beyond the clouds, beyond the tarmac, beyond the world itself. I rise,